Hey everybody, I just took a very long ride to get here. Interestingly, I've spoken at a bunch of conferences all around the world. I've been to the USA, I've been to India, I've been to all over the place, but I've never actually spoken at a conference in Vienna. This is a first, which is very exciting. I'm excited to be here. As you said, I want to talk to you about styling component-based systems, right? If you want to find me anywhere on the web, it's at mxsdbr, which you can see on the slide. If that looks kind of complicated, it's just my name without vowels. So just take my name, remove all of the vowels, and you get my handle pretty much everywhere. I'm the co-founder of a community platform called Spectrum. We have this problem where large online communities all around the world are organizing on platforms that really aren't made for them, right? For example, you have React.js who discuss on Discord. But the problem with all of these single stream of chat platforms is that they don't scale. As soon as you get more than a couple dozen active members, you can add as many channels as you want. It'll get very confusing very fast. And so Spectrum aims to solve that by sort of mixing a traditional forum with a chat app and sort of intermingling them in a single platform. You should go and check it out. We have some really cool communities on there, from front-end to React to Node.js, lots of stuff on there. Just go to spectrum.chat/explore and take a look. I'm here today because I want to tell you a little story. Before I worked on Spectrum, I worked at an agency. And that agency was very specialized on React, right? We worked mainly with startups or medium-sized companies and helped them get their dynamic applications off the ground because we liked it, React. And for that purpose, and because we built a lot of prototypes, we built a common UI library that we just used throughout most of our projects, right? So we built that UI library, and then we thought, well, now we've built this UI library, so we might as well open source it so other people can use it too. It's called Elemental UI. You can view it on GitHub and download it and use it yourself. And if you go to the Elemental UI website and scroll down a bit, you'll see the sort of typical open source project installation instructions, right? You have the npm install and a couple of setup steps. And then there's this note right in the middle. Now, I know that this is quite small, so I took the liberty of making it a bit bigger. That note says, elemental styling is currently written in less, so you will need a less compiler in your build process. Now, that seems like a sensible thing to mention at that point, right? Elemental styling is written in less, which we were using at the time very heavily for all of our projects, basically. So for us, it made sense to build our own component library with less as well. But if you think about it from the perspective of a consumer of the library, it makes a little less sense. Because imagine if you're using Sass. Now, to use our component library, you have to include a completely separate build toolchain just to render a button that we made. On top of that, what that note doesn't say is that you also have to use Webpack because we use CSS modules. So we wrote this component library, and you want to use it, but if you want to use it, you're suddenly tied into a very specific JavaScript build toolchain and CSS build toolchain. That's less than optimal, right? You just want to render a button, but you had to actually set up and configure all of this build toolchain to do it. There's a famous quote by Joey Armstrong, the creator of Erlang, a functional programming language, which I'm sure you know, about object-oriented programming. And he said, you wanted a banana, but what you got was a gorilla holding the banana and the entire jungle. He was talking about object-oriented programming, right? This is a very famous quote where he argues that functional programming is superior in some cases. Slightly rephrased, this fits very well to Elemental UI. You wanted a button, but what you got was a gorilla holding the button and an entire build toolchain. That's what Elemental UI is like, right? You end up having to include all of this huge amount of build tooling just to render our button and our heading, and it's ridiculous, right? It just doesn't work it's not a good solution. So almost 3 years ago, we opened an issue and started discussing about a better way to handle our styling for our component library. I, at the time, was down in Australia meeting a friend called Sharky. And Sharky took me to this lovely bar in Sydney called Uncle Mings. Uncle Mings is a really kind of shady Chinese bar, right? It's off of a main street in Sydney, but you have to go down this sort of unmarked stairwell into like a cellar area through a tiny door that's totally unmarked. You can't see it from the outside. And you walk in, and it's this dimly lit room, and they have some of the best whiskey you can get. I'm not a whiskey person, but Sharky is, and so he took me there to introduce me to the world of whiskey. And they also have some amazing finger foods with tempura and dumplings. if you're ever in Sydney, you should go to Uncle Mings if you can find it. And so we were there, and I was talking to him, and then he mentioned that another friend from Melbourne was in town for a week, just for work, and he invited him to come and join us. And that friend turned out to be Glen Maddern. Now, if you don't know Glen, Glen is one of the creators of CSS Modules, which Elemental UI used. And we had all of these troubles with Elemental UI, and so I talked to Glen about it, right? I asked Glen, look, Glen, we're having this problem, this build toolchain you have to use Elemental UI. It's really annoying. Users hate it. We hate it because we might not want to use less anymore. Have you ever run into that? Like, what do we do? And Glen said, yeah, I've run into that problem. I've thought about this a bit. Have you heard about this thing called CSS in JavaScript? And I remember looking at Glen and going, what? What is he talking about? Why would you ever put CSS into Java? How does that even make any sense? Those are two separate languages. And I said, Glen, I mean, I trust you, you're great, but what the fuck are you talking about? And Glen said, look, hear me out for a second, right? Imagine if you put all of your CSS into JavaScript and then dynamically inject it into a style tag at runtime. What happens is your users already have a JavaScript build toolchain, right? If they're using React, they're already using whatever JavaScript build tool they want. So they don't have to add any specific toolchain to use your component library. Also, they don't have to add any CSS build toolchain because it's injected from JavaScript, right? On top of that, you can also add dynamic capabilities because when you inject CSS at runtime, you don't have to resort to less syntax or Sass syntax to have variables and stuff like that. You can just have variables in JavaScript, right? You don't need any specific syntax anymore. It's just JavaScript. And I said, OK, sounds kind of intriguing, a bit slow maybe, but kind of intriguing. Where do I go with this? And Dan said, look, you definitely want to be using CSS in JavaScript, right? It's all JavaScript, so people don't have to do anything special. That makes total sense. So CSS in JavaScript is definitely the right way to go, but there's a slight caveat there, because while at the time when this happened, which is now 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there were existing projects exploring this world of CSS and JS, none of them really solved our use case specifically, right? Almost all of them required you to write CSS as JavaScript objects, which is very annoying, right? CSS is especially the syntax of CSS is very, very sensible, right? CSS is a great language, and it's been designed for many years by very many smart people to work well for what it does. So throwing all of that away didn't seem like such a good idea. We wanted to write actual CSS. So we started from scratch, right, from some first principles. And the thing that we really started from, our starting point were components, right? Now, if you think about a typical component, let's talk about a button, right? Almost everybody has a button component. It's a very obvious thing to have. Your button, by default, might look something like this, right? You have a button component which has a class name of btn. Again, this is using React syntax because I like React. You might have a bigger button, right? And normally, you would do something like this. You would add a second class name that says btn -- primary, right? This is the BEM syntax, which I'm sure many of you have seen before. And if you want to make it disabled, because users shouldn't be able to click the button, you set a specific class name, btn -- disabled, and you also set the type to disabled. Now, this is very, very typical, right? There's nothing fancy going on here. It's your standard button. But if you look at this more closely, all of these attributes are really implementation details to the consumer of a component. It's important to differentiate between the person who writes a component and the person who uses a component. The power of components is that a user of a component doesn't have to worry about what exactly a component does, right? Usually in the React world, what you would see is something like this. You would just have a button component. You would have a button primary component. You would have a button disabled component, right? And when I get a design from a designer, or I make a design myself, and I want to render a button, or I want to render a primary button, I just import that component and use it. I don't have to worry about exactly what it means that a button is primary or what exactly it means that a button is disabled. I don't have to worry about any of that. Only the person who works on the component and fixes a bug maybe or is the first to implement it has to worry about it. And so oftentimes, you might be the person implementing a component and the person using a component, and that's perfectly fine. But what that allows you to do is understand the whole system much more easily. Because if you don't have to worry about what exactly a button does, or what exactly an accordion does, or what exactly a heading does, then you can focus on your own logic without having to worry about every single small implementation detail, right? You just get a design that has a button, and then you render a button. You get a design that has a primary button, and you render a primary button. You don't have to worry about what specifically it means that a button is primary. Now, over time, as the web has worked more and more with components, and especially in the React world, there's been this uprising of what I like to call style components, right? So think about something you have in almost every application, a grid, right? Previously, you would do something like div class name equals row and div class name equals col5, right? You've probably seen those a million times. They're everywhere, right? It's the bootstrap grid. Everybody's used that at some point. But with React, what we can do is encapsulate these into components again, right? We don't have to worry about which specific class names to apply. We can just do something like this, right? We can have a row component and a column component with a width prop. Now, what that allows the creator of a component to do is to switch out the implementation at any point, right? Let's say this component library was built in 2014. Flexbox might not have had the browser support you wanted, so you used floats for your grid. A very standard thing to do, you just use floats. Now it's 3 years later, Flexbox is widely supported, and your browser support has improved as well, so you no longer need to use floats, you can just use Flexbox. If you tie yourself to a specific class name, it might be very hard to switch from a float-based grid to a Flexbox-based grid. But because it's encapsulated into these components, you don't actually have to worry about it, right? The creator of the component can now just switch the implementation details specifically. As long as it's a row stays a row and a column stays a column, you don't have to worry about it at all, right? Now, that probably goes a step further with CSS Grid, right? Now that CSS Grid is gaining steam in the browser world, it's now almost perfectly supported, and it'll soon be perfectly supported for almost any application except for legacy enterprise applications, maybe. At that point, the creator of such a component could just switch to CSS Grid without any trouble, right? Even though CSS Grid works entirely differently, and you might not even apply class names anymore, you could still just switch over one day to the next, and nothing would happen, right? The user of a component would be none the wiser. So when Glen and I sat down and thought about how we wanted our own CSS and JS library to look like, we wanted to move the styling to the component level by default. And that was the first big breakthrough that we had. That was the first big breakthrough where we went, oh, actually, why don't we do that? Now, the way we imagined it at the time, it looked something like this, right? Const comp equals lm div, and then some way of specifying CSS or styles, right? And this comp variable then would be a React component in this case, which you could render anywhere in your application. What we've done here is tie the styles to a specific component. Every piece of styling is tied to a component and can't be reused. If you want to reuse a piece of styling, you reuse the component, right? The second big breakthrough we had was how to specify that styling we have. What we wanted to do and what we set out to do was to let you write actual CSS in JavaScript. Now, the way we imagined this to look like at the time, this was, by the way, after the whiskey. So we drank a lot of whiskey, had some crazy ideas, and then the next day we met at a coffee shop and started hacking next to each other and figuring out what we wanted to do. And so this is what we imagined the first version to look like, really. You say const comp equals lm div, and then a string of CSS. And our library would take that string of CSS at runtime and inject it as a style tag in the head of the DOM, which meant you could use any CSS in there you want. Now, as of year 6, JavaScript has this very interesting feature in the language that's called tagged template literals. Now, I want you to watch this slide very closely, because I'm going to press a button, and almost nothing is going to change, but it makes a huge difference, right? 3, 2, 1. Not that big of a difference, right? But it actually makes huge difference in what you can do. Because previously, this was a template literal, right? Also introduced in ES 2015, template literals allow you to have interpolations. The problem with template literals is that they stringify all interpolations. But tagged template literals don't. When you have a tagged template literal, any interpolation will be passed to that function. So what this essentially does is you could replace those backticks with parentheses with a string, and it would almost do the same thing, almost. The thing that tagged template literals allowed us to do was using functions for conditional styling. So what we could now do is something like this, where you say const comp equals lmdiv, then a tagged template literal, and then you can say color. And then you have this function right here, an arrow function in this case, also an ES6 feature, where you say props, and then if props.primary is set to something truthy, the color will be blue, otherwise the color will be red. This wouldn't work with any other string, because any other string would take that interpolated function and stringify it. So you'd literally have that function as a string in your CSS, which is not what you want. We want to evaluate that function and run it and figure out which case you want to run, which case you want to have. Now, this all resulted in a library that's called styled components. That name came a lot later, but this is what it's called nowadays. As I said, the first big breakthrough that I want to really hammer in your head is that we removed the mapping between styles and components. Every fragment of CSS, every piece of styling in your application is now tied to a component by default. Now, style components look something like this, right? You import styled from styled components, and then you say const title equals style.h1. Now, this syntax also came a little bit later. Don't worry about it too much. This style.h1 thing is a function that's called as a tag template literal. And what you pass that tag template literal is a piece of CSS, right? So now our title variable here is a React component that will render an h1 DOM node that will have a font size of 1.5 am, will be aligned to the center, and will have a color of pale violet red. It's kind of obvious, right? Style.h1 with some styling. You just get a styled heading 1. Not that big of a deal. Now here we have a second component. Same principle applies. Const wrapper equals styled.section, which you call as a tag template literal. And then again, we pass in some styles. So our wrapper in this case will render a section that has a padding of 4 am, will be fully sized to have 100% width and height, and have a background of papaya whip. Now these color names, by the way, they're amazing. CSS has some of the best color names ever. Now, these are your normal React components, right? So title and wrapper can just be used like any other React component in your application, right? You just say wrapper and title, and we put some text in there. Hello world, this is my first styled component. If we look at this in a browser, what you will see is that we have a section with a papaya whip background and an h1 with a pale violet red color that's centered in the middle of the page. It's kind of obvious, right? I mean, obviously that's what would happen because that's what we said would happen. Now, as you can see, again, you can write actual CSS. But when I say actual CSS, I mean actual CSS. Previously, a lot of the sort of first CSS and JS libraries would use inline styles, right? They would inject a style attribute, which meant you couldn't use media queries, you couldn't use pseudo selectors, you couldn't use pseudo elements. Inline styles have a lot of limitations. Styled components let you write actual CSS, because we take that CSS and we inject it as a style tag in the head of the DOM, which means you can use media queries, nesting, pseudo selectors, pseudo elements. Anything CSS can do, styled components can do as well. So, for example, here we have a color changer component, which will render a section HTML tag, which has a background of papaya whip, and any h2 within that section will have a color of pale violet red, and then also at a min width of 875 pixels with its standard media query, we want to change the background to medium sea green and the heading to papaya whip. If you look at this in a browser, it looks like this by default. But then when you make it bigger, what happens is it changes its color. Yeah, thank you. It's CSS media queries. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, that's just CSS media queries, right? You've used them a million times. There's nothing fancy going on here. It's literally just CSS. We're not doing anything fancy under the hood. It's literally just CSS media queries, nothing more, nothing less. Now let's talk about adapting based on props. If you think back to the first thing I talked about, the button component, we had these two states in our button component, a normal button and a primary button. And we switched between those with this primary property that we set whenever we want to have a primary button, whatever that means, right? A bigger button, bolder button, whatever. So now, when we built this component with styled components, this is what it could look like. And specifically, I want you to focus on these interpolations, right? Because we adapt the colors of the button based on the primary prop being set or unset. So in this case, the background of our button will be pale violet red if it's primary, and white if it's not primary. And the color will be white if it's primary, but pale violet red if it's not primary. So exactly inverted, right? Makes sense. Primary button is more full, has more color. Again, these can be used like any React components. They're not special. They're just your standard React components. You say button or button primary. And then when you look at this in your browser, you have a normal button and a primary button. Duh. What else would there be, right? It's just a normal button and a primary button. But what that also allows us to do is dynamic theming. And this is where things get really powerful, right? Back when it built styled components, CSS attributes, custom attributes, were just coming out. And they're still on the cusp of becoming very, very popular because the browser support isn't quite excellent yet. But we wanted to have CSS custom attributes really badly, even on IE9 or whatever, because we wanted our component library to be themable, right? We wanted people to quickly just change the entire color scheme in one go. So what we built is a theme capability, right? You can import this theme provider from styled components, and then you can specify a theme. That theme can be anything you want. We don't care, right? Whatever you want to put in your theme, you put in your theme. And then you can wrap your app in a theme provider with that theme. And you can not only wrap your entire app into that theme provider, you can even wrap parts into that theme provider, right? From our components, you can then go, the background should be whatever is set as props.theme.primary, right? So our button will now have a background of whatever the primary theme is. In this case, if you go back to the previous slide, you'll see the primary color is pale violet red. So now our button will have a pale violet red background, right? Nothing fancy going on there. Obviously, that happens. It gets much more interesting when you have different themes and when you switch them out at runtime. Because what you can now do is have two separate themes, right? One red theme, which is pale violet red, and a blue theme, which is green. Oh, that's a mistake in my slides. That should be a green theme. Anyways, and one blue theme, which for some reason makes everything green. Whatever. And then you have two theme providers, right? One that passes the red theme and one that passes the blue theme. And what I want you to note about these button components is that we don't change the button components at all. We don't have to tell our buttons whether they should be red or green, right? It's all done implicitly through the tree of HTML. So our buttons don't change, but depending on in which area of the app they're rendered in, they'll either have a red background or a green background. So these two buttons now being rendered with these two separate themes, one will have a red background and one will have a green background, right? And again, let me state this. We didn't change anything about the way the button is rendered, right? In fact, that button could be miles and miles and miles from your theme provider, right? There could be as many HTML elements and components and whatever in between, that button would still get the wrapped theme, which means adding a night mode to your application is very simple. You just switch out the theme, right? If you just want to have a black interface, it's really easy to do. So to summarize, I drank a lot of whiskey and had a crazy idea. And out of that came styled components, which is now one of the most widely used CSS and JavaScript libraries. That's all I've got for you today. Please come find me after the talk, because I've got a bunch of stickers. So if you want to have a styled component sticker, just come find me, I'll give you one. And thank you for having me.
Excellent. Is that Craig Sharkey?
Sorry?
Was that Craig Sharkey?
Sorry? Yeah, Craig Sharkey.
Yeah, I worked with him in Yahoo years and years ago.
Oh, nice.
That seems to be the one guy in Australia that does web stuff that everybody knows.
Yeah, he's for some reason, but nobody knows.
And he gets people drunk, and then random stuff like that happens. This is amazing.
Sharky's great. If you're ever in Sydney, go meet Sharky and drink some whiskey with him.
He's lovely. Yeah, he always wears shorts, no matter where he is. If there's snow outside, it's weird.
It's such an Australian thing.
Yeah. OK, we got questions. What approach do you suggest to get best performances with styled components? Are there anti-patterns to avoid?
Yes. One big anti-pattern that I see all the time is people creating components in the render method. Because they don't realize that what that does is recreate the component every single time your application renders. People just put it in there, and it'll work in some cases, but it'll be very slow, and then it'll break as soon as you want to switch anything around. That's the biggest anti-pattern I've seen of people using styled components.
Or using green buttons in a blue component.
Yeah, or using a blue theme that's green. That's also not a very good idea.
Excellent. If the CSS is generated client-side after JS parsing, what are the performance implications compared to a standard style sheet? I like that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. The thing is that the browser has this very nice API, insert rule, which is by the CSS object model, which is something that most people don't know. What that allows us to do is inject up to about 110,000 rules of CSS in about a frame, so 16 milliseconds, which your normal application will never have 100, or should never have 100,000 lines of CSS, right? And also, because, so that first breakthrough we had, right, tying each piece of styling to a component allows us to keep track of which components you've actually used. Meaning, when you server-side render a styled components application, we know exactly which components you used and where, and we only ever send down that piece of CSS. So out of the box, you get critical CSS without having to do anything. Right? It just works out of the box, which means if you do server-side rendering, it'll likely be faster than sending down a 2 megabyte style sheet that you would normally have for your entire application.
You still have the flakiness of JavaScript, though.
Of course, yeah. If you mess up your JavaScript, your users won't see anything if you don't server-side render. But that'll be true either way, right? Even without styled components. Doesn't matter. If you don't server-side render, you won't see anything if your JavaScript big. If you server-side render, styled components will have put the style tags into the HTML statically, so your users will be perfectly fine even without JavaScript.
And of course, there's the race condition of like a style being a blocker in the rendering up front, whereas a JavaScript injected style can be done after the first render.
Yeah.
Why does styled components on React Native not support media queries? Right now, getting responsive design working is quite hard.
So as I said, styled components let you use actual CSS. On React Native, that doesn't exist. There is no actual CSS on React Native, right? They have their own layout engine that looks like CSS. Meaning, we're bound to what React Native can do, right? We can't have media queries because React Native doesn't have media queries. That doesn't exist. There are libraries that give you media queries in React Native, but you have to use them yourself. We can't do anything there, right? The underlying layout engine has no idea what media queries are, so we can't support them.
Because there's no on-the-fly re-rendering that the browser gives us.
There is, but React Native doesn't render to a browser. Since it all compiles down to native code, they have their own layout engine called Yoga. And Yoga just doesn't have media, that doesn't exist, right? Because it's optimized for mobile devices. They just never implemented them because who needs media queries when you only write? When you know your screen is only ever going to be this big. Now, that assumption isn't entirely true, right? Because people could be using tablets, but that's the trade-off they went with, right? I don't know why that is. I don't work on React Native, but they just don't have media queries.
And with grid support and Flexbox support, a lot of the media queries that we use for layout is probably not a good idea nowadays anyways.
Very true, especially with grid.
Any idea how to avoid the problem of external CSS interfering with styled components? Do never use important. I'm not
never
reading
use
this.
important. But styled components has a very nice way of increasing the specificity.
Specificity is a wonderful word, isn't it?
I know, I hate it. We have an entry in our frequently asked questions on the website. Just go check that out, because you'd have to look at the code. You just add ampersands, but go look at the website. This is too involved for a Q&A.
OK, what's the best way to test styled components? How to avoid test failures when the CSS changes, but the visual appearance doesn't?
I would never test CSS. Not in the way that you expect it to be. I think with the way, so most, I'll caveat this with my experience at the companies I've worked at and the projects I've worked at, there'll never be a case where the user interface doesn't change every single day. Right? My whole job is changing the user interface every single day. So tests that verify that something looks correct are, by definition, very brittle because what is correct changes every single day. Right? What you should check is that your CSS renders cross-platform correct. right? It should still look good on Edge, on Firefox, on Chrome, and maybe even on Internet Explorer if you have to support it, right? That should be tested, but there's tools out there that have nothing to do with styled components, right? Browser Labs and Source Labs and
Source Labs,
Yeah.
Browser Stack is
Browser
free,
Stack.
for example, as well.
I didn't know that actually.
Well,
That's great.
we supported them, and that's why it's free now.
That's
yeah.
great. That's great. Yeah. So anyway, do that, but that has nothing to do with styled components specifically.
What's the main difference to CSS modules?
CSS modules is not CSS in JavaScript. CSS modules lets you write CSS in CSS files, and then you import that CSS file, and you get this, through some build time magic, you get this JSON object which has all of the class names. The big problem with CSS modules is, as I said, that it requires a specific build tool, Webpack, with a very specific configuration. You can't just use, it's not something that the web has, right? CSS modules isn't something that's just there. You have to use Webpack, and you have to use the CSS loader and the style loader, and then they also, until very recently, didn't do critical CSS code splitting, so you'd always have one large CSS file. For our purpose, for a shared component library, as I said, didn't make sense, right? Because we wanted everybody to be able to use it, and everybody has JavaScript already, but not everybody is using Webpack.
So do styled components do critical path rendering up front, or do you just get a massive generated file?
No, you get the critical CSS. Because we can keep track of which components you've rendered, we only ever include their CSS, right? So we only ever include the critical CSS by default. We never send CSS you don't use.
Do you do deduping as well, like if people repeat the same settings in different components?
Not yet. We had some efforts on the way to switch to atomic CSS, right? Because styled components is an abstraction on top of CSS, right? So what we can do is change the underlying implementation to have better performance characteristics without you worrying. So theoretically, we could generate atomic CSS where each rule is its own class name, and then maybe the total size of your CSS might be smaller because you're repeating the same rule everywhere. There is CSS and JS libraries that do this. We don't yet. We just haven't done that yet.
Are there any best practices in naming? Because in CSS we always had the problem that people said like fat blue headline, and then later on it had to turn to green thin headline, and it didn't make any sense anymore.
Yeah.
So are there any best practices that you tell people to use with style components, or is it just up to the implementer?
Not necessarily. It's also a bit less of a problem, right? Because CSS has this global namescape where every class name has to be unique, right? For styled components, because it's in JavaScript, the variables can have the same name, but as long as they're in separate files, it doesn't really matter, right? So you can always give your components semantic names without having to worry about being unique in a set of thousands of class names, if that makes sense.
It still has a benefit, of course, for maintainability, for people who look at the code 5 weeks later and understand what something means.
Yeah, of course.
So
I think that's just a skill that developers have, to be honest. I don't think there's much we can do from the styled component side to encourage that. I think by not being global, we already allow you to give everything a semantic name, but it's up to you to give that semantic name because we can't know what you're doing, right? Like I don't know what that code means. You do, so give it a proper name.
Is styled components React strict mode ready?
Not yet, but we have an open PR that's almost done, so it'll be a week maybe or two, I assume.
Nice. Is the theme provider using Context API?
Yes, although, again, still the old one. We're working on updating it to the new React Context API, which is why it works throughout your entire component tree.
I'm going to skip the TypeScript or ES6 because it's kind of like meta for this, and yeah, it's a different story. What about accessibility when using styled components and not standard HTML5 tags, which can be interpreted by screen readers, for example?
That question doesn't entirely make sense.
It kind of makes sense, but it's more a React question than a styled component question.
It's more of a React question, yeah.
Because you don't know what under the hood gets rendered kind of thing.
Yeah, but you still specify the specific HTML5 tag that's rendered, right? So you can specify any HTML5 tag. It's up to you to choose the right one.
Well, one thing that would be nice to include would be, for example, a color contrast checker to make sure that actually the foreground and background colors are according. Developer tools in Chrome have that now built in. You can pick them the right way. That would be a fun thing to do, I guess. What about the Cascade? Can you use adjacent selectors or other cool CSS tricks?
You can use any CSS trick you've ever seen. Again, I want to stress this point, right? It's just CSS like you're used to. Whatever CSS can do, styled components can do. There's nothing fancy about it, right? We just take that CSS, put it into a style tag, into the DOM, and that's it, right? So anything you can do with CSS, you can do with styled components.
It was nothing new. I remember in YUI we used to create style tags all the time. If you want to have like a slider that resizes all the images, we just rewrote the style tag all the time.
Yeah, that's kind of what that does, except automatically under the hood.
Damn, we're doing the same things over and over again. My team is hesitant to use styled components because the class names are not immediately understood, which I pointed out earlier. How can we convince them?
Use the Babel plugin. We have a plugin for Babel, which will make all of your class names very nice. This is a language problem. JavaScript, a function in JavaScript, doesn't know what its name is unless you specify it with the function keyword. Which means if you say const wrapper equals style.div, we can't know that you wrote const wrapper. Right? So we do some build-time magic with the Babel plugin to tell styled components that the name of this specific component is wrapper, and then we put that into the class name. So if you use that Babel plugin, you'll get all of your component names directly in the class names like you used to.
Nice. Why should anyone use React over Angular when Angular has such a good software design and paradigm, the React complexity, which has really nothing to do with style components again, but
I don't know.
Why not
I like React.
Why not Vue.js?
I like Vue.js too. I actually like Vue.js a bit more than Angular.
So next year you're going to talk about Vue.js?
Maybe.
Why was less used the styling part of Element UI and not Sass? Pros and cons?
They're the same. We used less because that's what we used for most of our projects and what we were used to and where we already had all of our options configured correctly and stuff.
Could also be
that
less was JavaScript and Sass is Ruby?
Yeah, potentially at the time. But now Sass is JavaScript too. So
yeah. Okay.
It doesn't really matter anymore with Node Sass. They're pretty much the same. The syntax might be a bit different in some places, but they do the same thing.
It's one less problem to worry about.
Yeah.
How do you avoid too much code in a single file when using styled components?
Just like you avoid too much code in any other file by splitting it into multiple files. It's JavaScript. Like there isn't, you can put every component into its own file. There's nothing special about that,
But where do you cut it?
At the component level. So for example, our button component will be its own file, button.js. Our wrapper component will be its own file, wrapper.js. Our heading component will be its own heading.js, right? And so you never end up with, you always end up with one component in one file. At least that's the way I do it. I've seen some people also put a lot of components into one file, but that just becomes very unreadable very quickly.
Yeah, it's like any JavaScript large architecture. If you put too many things in one file and you don't name it properly, you don't know what it is, like something.js.
Yeah,
not a good idea. Support to pass objects as props.
Yes. You can pass whatever you want into the properties. It's just JavaScript, right? So you can pass whatever you want and do whatever you want with it. We don't care whether that's objects, strings, booleans, numbers, whatever.
Oh, casting is a wonderful thing, isn't it? What about bundle size?
Yeah, what about it?
Yeah. How can you keep your bundle size small is probably the question that he wanted to say.
Styled components is currently, I think, 12 kilobytes of JavaScript, which is fairly large. But the benefit of the critical CSS extraction when you server-side render probably mitigates that at least partially. And we're also working on the next version, the next major version of styled components will be probably a good third smaller, and we're constantly working on getting that size down even more. We're very focused on that, actually. It's one of our...
And I guess with ES6 support getting better, you have opportunities to actually make it smaller than before as well. Also with sets, for example, more memory efficient than before.
For sure.
CSS and JS is a very heated and divisive topic as laid on Twitter. No. A discussion on Twitter? Do you see any way out on that?
No. I think it'll always be... having thought about this for a long time now, I think CSS and JS is a nice workaround to underlying problems with the way, not problems, but things that don't yet exist in the DOM, right? We want to build component-based systems, and the DOM was made for documents. So we're trying to patch up that difference and make the DOM work for component-based systems. But I think with web components and Shadow DOM and all of those standardization processes, eventually in, I don't know how many years, styled components and other CSS and JS libraries will hopefully be obsolete because the browser gives you the same benefits out of the box, if that makes sense.
And the good thing is that browsers can learn from systems like styled components to understand what people are likely to use. It's not necessarily the best analytical approach or the best academic approach to programming, but it makes people happy. The same way we learned from jQuery what to put in the next version of ES6 when that came around.
Yeah, of course.
Does adding many style tags to the DOM significantly affect performance?
Not more than adding many CSS files. There's no difference from the browser side to that. And maybe actually it'll be a bit faster because you're only downloading one file rather than many files. But with HTTP2, that's again a bit debatable. With HTTP push, it doesn't really make a difference. It doesn't make, the browser engine doesn't differentiate whether the CSS is in a style tag or from a separate file.
And there's a serialization option as well to have like one style tag in the end.
Yeah, of course. And of course, you could only have one style. Yeah, of course, yeah.
How would you convert an existing SAS BEM architecture into a styled component?
That question probably applies to converting anything to anything else. Just do it one piece at a time, right? Don't try and rewrite everything, because that's never going to work. Just start using it gradually, and then as you touch old pieces of code, work them over into the new system, but don't try and move everything over at the same time, right? Just gradually over time, as you touch pieces of code, move them over. In fact, that's what Twitter did with Twitter Lite. They were using CSS modules, and they're now switching to a CSS and JS library called React Native Web. And they still have about 20% of their code base in CSS modules, but they're gradually moving over the code as they touch it, you know?
Is something like styled components available in the Angular world?
Sorry? I thought that was a statement.
Is something like styled components available in the Angular world?
I can see that, yeah. I don't know. I'm not very active in the Angular world. I think they have some built-in kind of CSS and JS features with their scoped styling thing, but I'm not an Angular expert. I don't know.
It's a different architecture, so it's kind of connected with the React architecture as well, isn't it?
Not 100% sure. I'm not the expert there.
Can I use media queries?
Yes.
Good. That one is easy. Could we just make a custom element called scoped style who inherit from style, but prefix every selector with the ID of its parents? Oh dear Lord. Yeah, could we?
We could do that. Yeah. I haven't thought about that at all. You should open an issue on the repo and we can discuss about it. I don't know what the downside or upsides of that would be right now.
Depends on the ID. I mean, yeah, it's weird. Okay.
I don't know how well custom elements. What's the custom elements browser support?
It's there, but the subclassing is a bit problem in terms of performance. That's why a lot of pre-processing made more sense.
I see.
How would you do a CSS component isolation, for example, CSS resets to prevent unintentional cascading?
Just like you normally would with normalized CSS. We don't force you to only use style components, right? So if you want to use normalized CSS to reset your CSS, just do that, right? We don't prescribe that you only have to use CSS. In fact, we have an escape hatch to inject global CSS as well. So you can just use that to inject your favorite CSS reset. We don't have anything to do with that.
Last one, could it be possible to deterministically extract and optimize the CSS in the future, e.g. chopping in up to minimal set of useful composable classes? Wow.
Maybe, but it'd be very hard because JavaScript is a very lenient language. You can do lots of things in JavaScript that are ever so slightly weird. And that makes it hard to statically analyze it in its fullest. I think something that's very interesting here is type systems like TypeScript and FlowType, who do a great deal of that already, right? And I think as they mature, I'm hoping that these type systems will allow us to hook into their underlying representation of the code base and maybe use that to extract or optimize the CSS at build time. But at the moment, that's not. No tooling exists that has such a fine-grained view of an entire JavaScript code base, right? That just doesn't exist at the moment.
Yeah, when you have a type system, it's much easier to do that kind of work.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Excellent. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
That was helpful.